Hello class, welcome to Supply and Demand Lesson 4. This one is on simple applications of supply and demand to events, current events, or from history. But I think all the examples I've given you are pretty much from current events. Okay, so the process is really simple. So simple that students oftentimes don't follow the process and then unfortunately they get in trouble. I recommend you do it like this. First, draw a standard supply and demand graph. Even before you read the problem, go ahead and draw a standard supply and demand graph. Mark the equilibrium price and quantity. Then after that, read the problem and identify the market that's been asked and title your graph. Students rarely title their graphs, but later when they get a little confused, they drift off of what the question is really about. So title your graph. It'll help you keep it straight. Those things are so simple that students almost never do them, but I really recommend it. Then determine which curve moves. This you have to figure out from the story. Keep in mind that in this simple process where your test questions come from, the idea 99% of the time is that one of the curves moves and the other one does not. Yeah, so if you think both curves have moved, you probably got it wrong. It's very, very rare that I would put a problem on a test where both curves moved. Finally, apply the graph that goes with the curves you've moved and just answer based on those graphs that we did in lesson 3. All right, so let's try one. Assume the government imposes a large tariff on imported steel. In case some of you don't know, a tariff is simply a tax, but the tax is imposed only on imported steel. There's no tax on domestic steel. So here are your questions. What will happen in the market for foreign steel? What will happen in the market for U.S.-made steel? What happens in the market for U.S.-made aluminum? And what happens in the market for U.S.-made cars? So let's do them one at a time. Step 1, draw a supply and demand graph, mark the equilibrium, then read the question and title the thing. So the first one was what happens in the market for foreign steel. All right, so we're going to put a tax on foreign steel. A tax is one of the determinants of supply curves, so it's just going to move the supply curve back, and now the rest is really mechanical. So the demand curve stayed the same, the supply curve decreased, quantity demanded and quantity supplied both decreased, and the price of foreign steel went up. So that's how you would just answer. It would be same, decrease, 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 increase, if you're filling out that chart that we did in the previous lesson. All right, U.S.-made steel. So in this case, you have to realize that U.S.-made steel and foreign steel are substitutes for each other. So since the foreign steel got more expensive, the demand curve for U.S.-made steel would shift out to the right. We'd get a new equilibrium out here. And the answers would be that the demand curve increased, the supply curve stayed the same, quantity demanded and quantity supplied both increased, and the price increased. The next question was, well, what happens in the market for aluminum? So aluminum is a substitute for steel. It's not an obvious substitute, but in some uses, aluminum would be a substitute. So if steel gets expensive, people would, where they could, would avoid expensive steel and would buy some substitute like aluminum. So the demand curve for aluminum would increase. There'd be a new equilibrium established here. The supply curve stays the same. Quantity demanded and quantity supplied both increase, and the price increases. Now this one's a little harder. What happens in the market for U.S.-made cars? What you have to realize is that steel and aluminum has gotten more expensive. Whether you buy it domestically or from foreign suppliers, those things are more expensive. They are a big component of the supply curve for U.S.-made cars. So with that tariff on foreign steel, the supply curve for U.S.-made cars will shift back to the left because it'll be more expensive to produce them. We'll get a new equilibrium here. So the answers would be the demand curve stayed the same. People who buy cars probably are completely unaware of what the tariff situation is on foreign steel. Demand curve stays the same, supply curve shifts back to the left, quantity demanded and quantity supplied both decrease, and the price increases. Then just think about all those other markets for products where steel is used as an input. It could be anything from the steel used in automobiles to the steel used in buildings or in other kinds of appliances. It doesn't matter. Anything that has steel as an input, the supply curve would shift back to the left. We would establish a new equilibrium here. The demand curve would stay the same. Quantity demanded and quantity supplied would both decrease, and the price would increase. Okay, now let's try another problem. Suppose that there's new technology that makes it easier to extract crude oil. This happened just a few years ago. What would happen in the market for crude oil? What would happen in the market for coal? And what happens in the market for gasoline? So, step one, draw the supply and demand graph, establish the equilibrium price and quantity, read the problem, and then title your graph. So in the first case, it was about what happens in the market for crude oil when we have this new technology that makes it easier to extract crude oil from the ground. So obviously the supply curve would shift out to the right. The demand curve would stay the same. Quantity demanded and quantity supplied would both increase, and the price of crude oil would fall. And it certainly did. As I recall, I think crude oil prices were somewhere around $90 a barrel before the innovation of fracking, and then they fell as low as $40 a barrel afterwards. And right now, at the production of this video, I think crude oil is about $60 a barrel. Okay, so crude oil got cheaper because of technological innovation. Now, the second one was what happens in the market for coal. So you draw a supply and demand graph, establish its equilibrium, title the thing, in this case it's coal. You have to realize that coal is a substitute for crude oil, right? So if crude oil gets really, really expensive, the demand curve for coal will fall. We'll establish a new equilibrium over here. Then the answers would be demand curve falls, supply curve stays the same, quantity demanded and quantity supplied both increase, and the price decrease for coal. Coal prices fall. Finally, what happens in the market for gasoline? So draw your supply and demand graph, establish equilibrium, title your graph gasoline. You have to recognize that crude oil is a primary input into the production of gasoline. So if crude oil gets less expensive, that's an input here. The supply curve would shift out to the right. Demand curve stays the same, but the supply curve is shifted out. Quantity demanded and quantity supplied would both increase, and the price of gasoline would decrease, which it has done. Okay, so the next lesson is the special case of price floors and price ceilings.